5 children went to bed on Christmas Eve. By morning, they were gone. No bodies, no bones, no ashes, nothing. The fire department said they burned alive. But their parents spent the rest of their lives believing something far darker had happened, that someone had set that fire deliberately and used it as a cover to steal their children away into the night. This is the story of the Sodder family. And 80 years later, no one has ever found the truth. To understand what happened on that Christmas night in 1945, you first need to understand the Sodder family. George Sodder was an Italian immigrant who had come to America from Sardinia in 1908, when he was just 13 years old. He arrived alone, worked on the Pennsylvania railroads, and eventually settled in Fayetteville, West Virginia, where he built a small but successful coal trucking business. He married a woman named Jenny, and together they built something remarkable, a family of 10 children. By Christmas 1945, their oldest son, Joe, was away serving in the military. That left 9 children at home: Marion, who was 19, and 8 younger siblings ranging in age from just 5 years old to 14. George was known in the community as a man who spoke his mind. He was vocal in his criticism of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, even as many in the Italian-American community stayed silent. This, as we will soon discover, may have made him a target. The Sodder house was a large 2-story home on Route 16 in Fayetteville. It was a busy, lively household, full of children, full of noise, full of life. On Christmas Eve 1945, all of that was about to change forever. The evening of December 24, 1945 began like any other Christmas Eve. The older children had stayed up late, enjoying the holiday. George and Jenny went to bed around midnight, along with their youngest children. The 5 older children, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, just 5 years old, were still awake, playing with their Christmas gifts. Then, sometime after midnight, Jenny Sodder was jolted awake by a phone call. A woman's voice was on the line, a stranger. The woman said nothing meaningful, just laughed, and then hung up. Jenny noticed something strange. Even though it was the middle of the night, the lights downstairs were still on, the front door was unlocked, and the curtains had not been drawn. These were all things her well-behaved children always did before going to sleep. Something felt wrong. She went back to bed. Around 1 in the morning, she heard a loud thump on the roof, something heavy hitting the house, then rolling off. She dismissed it as an animal and drifted back to sleep. Half an hour later, smoke began pouring into the bedroom. Jenny screamed for George. He woke immediately and they began rushing through the house. George, Jenny, and 4 of the children managed to escape through the windows and doors. But when they called out for Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, there was no answer. The staircase was already engulfed in flames. George tried everything. He ran back toward the house, breaking a window with his bare arm, cutting himself badly, but the fire was too intense to enter. He tried to get his ladder, the one he always kept propped against the side of the house. It was gone. He ran to his 2 coal trucks, planning to drive one up close enough to climb to the second-floor windows. Neither truck would start, even though both had worked perfectly the day before. He tried to reach the rainwater barrel to throw water on the flames. It was frozen solid. He stood outside in the cold December air, bleeding, screaming his children's names, as his house burned to the ground. By the time firefighters arrived, at 8 o'clock in the morning, more than 6 hours after the fire started, there was almost nothing left. The fire marshal inspected the ruins and quickly reached a conclusion. The fire had been caused by faulty wiring, and the 5 missing children had perished in the blaze. But George and Jenny Sodder could not accept that explanation. And when they began asking questions, the answers they got, or didn't get, only deepened their suspicion. First, there were no remains. In a typical house fire, human bones survive. Teeth survive. Even in the most intense fires, investigators find something. But in the ruins of the Sodder house, there was nothing. Not a single bone, not a tooth, not any identifiable remains from 5 children. The fire marshal's response? He said the fire had burned hot enough to completely consume the bodies. But experts later pointed out that this explanation made no scientific sense. A house fire does not burn at temperatures high enough to completely destroy human remains. Second, there were the strange events before the fire. In October 1945, just 2 months before Christmas, a life insurance salesman had come to the Sodder house. When George refused to buy a policy, the man became threatening. He looked at George and said, and I am quoting directly here, his house would go up in smoke and his children would be destroyed because of the dirty remarks George had been making about Mussolini. Around the same time, another stranger had visited the house asking about work. While he was there, he walked around to the back of the property and pointed at the fuse boxes, saying they would cause a fire someday, even though the wiring had recently been inspected and declared perfectly safe. And in the weeks before Christmas, George's older children had noticed a car parked along the highway near their school, with strangers inside who appeared to be watching the younger Sodder children as they walked home. Third, there were the missing ladder and the trucks that wouldn't start. George's ladder was found the next day, thrown into a ditch some distance from the house. Both trucks, which had worked perfectly on Christmas Eve, started without any problem on Christmas morning. Someone, it appeared, had disabled them during the night. In the days and weeks after the fire, something else began to happen. People started seeing the Sodder children. A woman came forward and said she had seen the 5 missing children watching the fire from a passing car on the night it happened. A hotel employee in Charleston, West Virginia reported seeing 4 of the children with 2 unknown adults the morning after the blaze. The children, she said, were unnaturally quiet. The adults refused to speak to staff and left quickly. Another woman reported seeing the children at a roadside restaurant between Fayetteville and Charleston on Christmas morning, again with 2 unknown adults. The Sodder family contacted authorities about every single one of these sightings. They were told the leads went nowhere. But George and Jenny were no longer willing to accept that their children had simply burned alive. They began their own search. They hired private investigators. They put up a billboard on Route 16, a large sign with photographs of each of the 5 missing children, asking, what was their fate? Were they kidnapped? Were they murdered? Were they still alive somewhere? The billboard stood for nearly 4 decades, a constant, haunting reminder to everyone who drove past it. Years passed. The Sodder children, if they were alive, were growing up somewhere. Then, in 1967, more than 20 years after the fire, something extraordinary happened. Jenny Sodder received a letter in the mail. It had no return address. Inside was a photograph. The photograph showed a young man, a man who appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s. On the back of the photograph were the words, Louis Sodder, I love you, Brother Frankie. The man in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Louis Sodder, the 9-year-old boy who had vanished in the fire 22 years earlier. Jenny was convinced it was him. She hired a private investigator to trace the letter's origin. The investigator traveled to the postmark city and was never heard from again. The photograph itself raised more questions than it answered. Who had sent it? Was it really Louis? Was someone trying to help the family? Or was someone playing a cruel hoax on a grieving mother? No one ever found out. Over the decades, investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths have proposed several theories about what happened to the Sodder children. Theory 1. The children died in the fire. This is the official explanation. Some investigators who have studied the case believe that the fire simply burned hot enough to destroy the remains, and that the sightings were well-meaning but mistaken. Under this theory, the strange events before the fire were coincidences, and the missing ladder and non-starting trucks were simply forgotten or mechanical failures. Theory 2. The mafia was involved. George Sodder had been openly critical of Mussolini at a time when the Italian-American mafia was deeply tied to fascist politics. Some researchers believe the threats he received were genuine and that his children were taken as punishment, either killed or sold into some form of servitude. Theory 3. The children were abducted and raised by others. Under this theory, the fire was deliberately set as a distraction while the children were taken from the house. They may have been raised by another family, possibly in Italy, with no knowledge of their real identities. The letter with Louis's photograph, under this theory, was sent by a sibling or cousin who had found out the truth. None of these theories has ever been proven. None of them has ever been disproven. George Sodder died in 1969. He never found his children. Jenny Sodder died in 1989. The billboard she and George had erected stood until shortly after her death, and then it was finally taken down because there was no one left to maintain it. Their youngest daughter, Sylvia, spent her entire life trying to keep the story alive. She believed until the day she died that her brothers and sisters had survived that night. Sylvia passed away in 2021, the last of the Sodder children. What happened on that Christmas night in Fayetteville, West Virginia, in 1945? Did 5 children burn alive without leaving a single trace of their existence? Or did someone use the cover of fire to steal them away, and did they spend their lives somewhere in the world, not knowing who they really were? 80 years later, we still don't know. The Sodder case remains one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries in American history. And somewhere, perhaps, the answer still exists, buried in old files, locked in someone's memory, or written on the back of a photograph that no one has found yet. If you found this video compelling, please subscribe and leave a comment below. What do you think happened to the Sodder children? I read every single comment. This has been True Old Crime, and this case is closed, for now.